In a quiet suburban neighborhood where life usually moved at a slow and predictable pace, an unexpected event shattered the calm. It was a typical evening, with families winding down after work and children playing outside as the sun dipped below the horizon. The streets were lined with modest homes, their windows glowing warmly in the fading light. But on this particular night, tension crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. Officer Mark Reynolds, a veteran of the local police department, had been patrolling the area for years. To some, he was a familiar face, someone who knew the names of the shopkeepers and could recall stories about the town's history. To others, however, he was a figure of unease. Over the years, whispers of complaints had circulated about his behavior during traffic stops and interactions with minority residents. Many felt uneasy around him but rarely spoke up, fearing retaliation or dismissal of their concerns. That evening, Reynolds received a call about a vehicle driving erratically near Maple Street. He didn't think much of it. It seemed like just another routine stop. As he approached the car, parked under the dim glow of a street lamp, he noticed something unusual. The driver was Assistant U.S. Attorney Elena Ramirez, a woman whose name had recently been making headlines. Known for her fierce dedication to civil rights cases, she had earned both admiration and animosity from different corners of society. Her presence here in this small suburb felt almost surreal. Reynolds tapped on the window, his flashlight illuminating the interior of the car. Ramirez rolled down the window, her expression calm but wary. She greeted him politely, explaining that she might have accidentally swerved while adjusting her phone mount. It was a minor infraction, hardly worth more than a warning. But instead of letting her go with a simple reprimand, Reynolds began asking pointed questions. His tone grew sharper, his words laced with thinly veiled hostility. "Do you always drive like this?" he asked, leaning closer to the window. "Or is it only when you're too busy chatting on your phone?" Ramirez, accustomed to high-pressure situations, maintained her composure. She apologized again and offered to show her license and registration. But as she reached for her documents, Reynolds interrupted her. "Slowly," he barked, his hand resting conspicuously on the grip of his holstered weapon. The casual observer might have missed it, but there was an unmistakable edge to his voice, a mix of suspicion and authority that made the moment feel heavier than it should have been. Witnesses later recounted how the interaction quickly took a turn. According to bystanders, Reynolds began making comments about Ramirez's heritage, implying that someone in her position shouldn't be driving such an expensive car. Ramirez, though visibly irritated, remained composed. She reminded him of her right to remain silent and requested that the conversation stay professional. Yet, rather than diffusing the situation, her assertiveness seemed to provoke him further. The tension escalated when Reynolds suddenly stepped back, his hand now gripping the handle of his gun. "Don't move," he shouted, his voice cutting through the stillness of the night. Ramirez froze, her hands raised slightly in a gesture of compliance. But witnesses reported seeing no aggressive movements on her part, just a woman trying to de-escalate a volatile situation. Despite this, Reynolds claimed he saw Ramirez reach toward the center console of her car, prompting him to draw his weapon. What happened next unfolded in mere seconds but would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. Shots rang out, echoing through the otherwise peaceful neighborhood. Ramirez slumped forward, clutching her side as blood seeped onto her clothes. Panic erupted among nearby residents, who rushed to help while dialing emergency services. Within minutes, ambulances and additional police units arrived, surrounding the scene like a swarm of bees. As paramedics worked to stabilize Ramirez, officers secured the area, cordoning off curious onlookers. News crews soon descended upon the neighborhood, drawn by reports of a federal prosecutor being shot during what was supposed to be a routine stop. Social media lit up with speculation and outrage, fueled by snippets of information shared by eyewitnesses. Some described Reynolds' demeanor as unnecessarily aggressive. Others recalled hearing racial slurs moments before the shooting. While these accounts varied in detail, one thing was clear: the incident had struck a nerve. For Ramirez, the hours that followed were a blur of pain and confusion. She lay in the back of an ambulance, her thoughts racing as medics tried to keep her stable. Despite the chaos, she managed to provide a brief statement to investigators at the hospital, recounting what had transpired from her perspective. Her words painted a stark contrast to Reynolds's version of events, setting the stage for a deeply polarizing debate. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Back at the station, colleagues whispered among themselves, unsure whether to defend him or distance themselves from the controversy. For many, the case raised uncomfortable questions about bias and accountability within law enforcement. Was Reynolds truly acting out of fear for his safety, as he claimed? Or had years of unchecked misconduct finally caught up with him? As the days passed, the story dominated headlines across the country. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, holding signs that read, "Justice for Elena, and no more excuses." Community leaders called for immediate action, demanding reforms to address systemic issues long ignored. For some, the shooting was not just an isolated incident, but a symptom of deeper problems plaguing society. Amidst the turmoil, Ramirez fought hard to recover, drawing strength from the outpouring of support she received. Friends, family, and even strangers rallied around her, offering messages of encouragement and solidarity. Though physically weakened, she resolved to use her experience as a catalyst for change. Little did she know, her journey was far from over, and the fight for justice was only beginning. In the days following the shooting, the nation was gripped by a whirlwind of emotions: anger, disbelief, and an overwhelming demand for answers. The incident had struck a nerve not just because it involved a federal prosecutor, but also because it highlighted the deep-seated issues that had long plagued communities across the country. As investigators began piecing together what happened that fateful evening, the focus shifted to uncovering the truth behind Officer Mark Reynolds's actions and whether they were driven by prejudice or something else entirely. The first piece of critical evidence came from Reynolds' body camera footage, which was promptly reviewed by Internal Affairs and later shared with prosecutors handling the case. What the video revealed painted a troubling picture. From the start of the traffic stop, Reynolds's demeanor appeared unusually aggressive, his tone sharp and commanding despite the lack of any apparent threat. He repeatedly questioned Ramirez's intentions, his words laced with skepticism and thinly veiled hostility. At one point, he even made a comment about her car being too nice for someone like her, an offhand remark that seemed innocuous at first glance, but took on sinister undertones when viewed in context. But the most damning moment came when Reynolds claimed Ramirez had reached for something in her car, prompting him to draw his weapon. The footage, however, told a different story. There was no sudden movement, no suspicious gesture, just Ramirez sitting calmly behind the wheel, complying with his instructions. This discrepancy between Reynolds' account and the visual evidence became a pivotal point in the investigation, raising serious questions about his credibility. As detectives dug deeper into Reynolds' past, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Over the years, several complaints had been filed against him alleging racial profiling and excessive force. One case involved a young black man who said Reynolds had pulled him over without cause and used derogatory language during the encounter. Another complaint came from a Latina woman who accused Reynolds of making inappropriate remarks about her immigration status. None of these allegations had resulted in disciplinary action. Each had been dismissed after cursory reviews by higher-ups within the department. To many observers, this history of unchecked misconduct suggested a culture of impunity, a system that allowed officers like Reynolds to operate with little accountability. It wasn't just about one bad apple. It was about the barrel itself, rotting from within. These revelations fueled public outrage, with activists calling for sweeping reforms to ensure that law enforcement agencies held their members to higher standards. Meanwhile, Assistant U.S. Attorney Elena Ramirez continued to recover in the hospital, her condition slowly improving, thanks to the tireless efforts of medical staff. Despite her injuries, she remained determined to play an active role in seeking justice, not just for herself, but for countless others who had suffered similar injustices. Investigators visited her bedside multiple times, carefully documenting her recollection of events. She recounted how Reynolds' behavior had escalated rapidly, leaving her feeling cornered and powerless. Though shaken, she described the shooting as a calculated act rather than a spontaneous reaction. Ramirez's testimony provided a human face to the tragedy, reminding everyone of the real-life consequences of unchecked power. Her courage inspired others to come forward with their own stories. A local journalist named Maria Lopez launched an investigative series featuring interviews with residents who had encountered Reynolds in the past. One elderly Asian man tearfully described how Reynolds had mocked his accent during a routine traffic stop, reducing him to tears. A teenage boy recalled being detained for hours simply because he fit the description of a suspect, a vague justification that carried no weight upon closer inspection. These accounts added depth to the narrative, illustrating how systemic racism permeated everyday interactions. The mounting evidence against Reynolds prompted prosecutors to take decisive action. They charged him with attempted murder and violating civil rights, a rare move given the legal protections typically afforded to law enforcement officers. The charges sent shockwaves through the community, sparking heated debates about fairness and accountability. Some argued that Reynolds deserved due process, while others insisted that enough was enough, that the time had come to hold those in power responsible for their actions. Behind the scenes, lawyers on both sides prepared for what promised to be a high-stakes legal battle. Prosecutors meticulously assembled their case, relying heavily on the body cam footage, witness statements, and Ramirez's testimony. They also subpoenaed Reynolds's personal communications, hoping to find additional evidence of bias. Their efforts paid off when they discovered a series of text messages exchanged between Reynolds and fellow officers. In one message, he referred to minority citizens using offensive slurs, dismissing them as criminals waiting to happen. Another message joked about planting evidence to justify arrests, further tarnishing his reputation. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, scrambled to counter the prosecution's arguments. They portrayed Reynolds as a dedicated officer who had acted out of fear for his life, emphasizing the inherent dangers of police work. They argued that the body cam footage didn't capture the full scope of the situation, suggesting that Ramirez might have made a sudden move invisible to the camera. To bolster their case, they called upon expert witnesses to testify about the split-second decisions officers often had to make in high-pressure situations. As preparations for trial intensified, so did public interest in the case. News outlets covered every development extensively, broadcasting live updates and analyzing potential outcomes. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Justice for Alina and Accountability Now, amplifying calls for reform. Protesters gathered outside courthouses and police stations, holding vigils and marches to keep the issue in the spotlight. For many, the case represented more than just one officer's misconduct. It symbolized a broader struggle for equality and justice. Through it all, Ramirez remained steadfast, channeling her pain into purpose. She gave interviews to major networks, sharing her story with millions of viewers. She spoke passionately about the need for transparency and accountability in law enforcement, urging lawmakers to implement policies that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Her eloquence and resilience earned her widespread admiration, turning her into a reluctant yet powerful advocate for change. By the time the trial date approached, the stage was set for a landmark legal showdown. The nation watched with bated breath, knowing that the outcome would reverberate far beyond the courtroom. Would justice prevail, or would the system once again fail those it was meant to protect? For Elena Ramirez, the answer mattered deeply. Not just for her own healing, but for the countless lives hanging in the balance. The trial of Officer Mark Reynolds began on a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air feels heavy with anticipation. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Lawyers, reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens filled every available seat. Some had traveled from across the country to witness what many were calling the trial of the century. Television cameras lined the back wall, their lenses trained on the judge's bench while microphones captured every word spoken. Outside, protesters held signs demanding justice, their voices echoing faintly through the courthouse windows. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but orderly, as if everyone present understood the gravity of the moment. Prosecutors led by Assistant District Attorney Lisa Chen opened the case with a powerful opening statement. Standing before the jury, Chen painted a vivid picture of the events that unfolded on that fateful night. She described how Elena Ramirez, a respected federal prosecutor and advocate for civil rights, had been subjected to an unwarranted display of aggression during what should have been a routine traffic stop. Chen emphasized the racial undertones of Reynolds's behavior, pointing out his derogatory remarks and the pattern of misconduct that preceded the shooting. Her tone was calm yet forceful, as she argued that this wasn't just about one officer, it was about holding accountable those who abused their power and perpetuated systemic racism. "We are here today not only to seek justice for Ms. Ramirez," Chen said, her voice steady, "but to send a message that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it." Defense attorney Gregory Hayes countered with an equally compelling narrative. A seasoned litigator known for his ability to sway juries, Hayes portrayed Reynolds as a dedicated public servant caught in an impossible situation. He acknowledged that the circumstances surrounding the shooting were tragic, but insisted that Reynolds had acted out of genuine fear for his life. Hayes reminded the jury of the inherent dangers police officers face daily, arguing that split-second decisions made under pressure shouldn't be judged harshly in hindsight. To bolster his argument, he introduced expert witnesses who testified about the psychological stress officers endure during high-risk encounters. As the trial progressed, both sides presented their evidence with meticulous precision. The prosecution relied heavily on the body cam footage, which became central to their case. Prosecutors played the video repeatedly, pausing at key moments to highlight discrepancies between Reynolds's account and what the camera actually recorded. They also called upon eyewitnesses who had watched the incident unfold from nearby homes and sidewalks. These witnesses recounted hearing Reynolds make racially charged comments and seeing Ramirez remain compliant throughout the ordeal. Their testimonies added emotional weight to the prosecution's argument, painting a clear picture of an unjustified escalation. One particularly gripping moment came when Assistant U.S. Attorney Elena Ramirez took the stand. Though still recovering from her injuries, she appeared composed and resolute as she recounted the harrowing experience. Dressed in a simple navy blue suit, she spoke softly but firmly, her words carrying immense authority. She described how Reynolds' demeanor shifted from professional to confrontational within minutes, leaving her feeling targeted and vulnerable. When asked about the moment when Reynolds drew his weapon, Ramirez paused, her composure faltering slightly as tears welled up in her eyes. "I remember thinking, this can't be real," she said, her voice trembling. "I hadn't done anything wrong. I was following his instructions, and then everything changed." Her testimony struck a chord with the jury and spectators alike. Many in the courtroom wiped away tears as she explained the lasting impact of the shooting, not just physically but emotionally and psychologically. For Ramirez, the trial wasn't just about seeking accountability. It was about reclaiming her dignity and ensuring that others wouldn't suffer the same fate. The defense fought back fiercely, attempting to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. Hayes grilled Ramirez during cross-examination, probing for inconsistencies in her story and questioning whether she might have inadvertently provoked Reynolds. He suggested that the dim lighting and angle of the body cam could have obscured crucial details, implying that Reynolds may have genuinely believed Ramirez posed a threat. While some jurors seemed skeptical of these arguments, others listened intently, their expressions unreadable. Another pivotal element of the trial came when prosecutors introduced damning text messages retrieved from Reynolds's phone. These messages revealed a pattern of racist language and attitudes, including jokes about planting evidence and mocking minority communities. One exchange in particular stood out. Reynolds had referred to Latinos as criminals in waiting and boasted about issuing tickets disproportionately to people of color. When confronted with this evidence, Reynolds appeared visibly uncomfortable on the stand, his usual confidence wavering under intense scrutiny. Throughout the proceedings, the courtroom buzzed with whispered commentary and murmurs of disbelief. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, capturing every detail for their articles. Social media exploded with reactions, hashtags like #TruthInCourt trending nationwide. Supporters of Ramirez praised her bravery, while critics of Reynolds accused him of embodying everything wrong with modern policing. The divide was palpable, reflecting the broader societal tensions simmering beneath the surface. Judge Margaret Holloway maintained strict control over the proceedings, ensuring that emotions didn't derail the pursuit of justice. Her stern demeanor commanded respect, and she frequently reminded both sides to stick to the facts rather than resorting to theatrics. Despite the media circus swirling outside, the courtroom remained a space of focused deliberation, a microcosm of democracy in action. As closing arguments approached, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Prosecutor Lisa Chen delivered a stirring finale, urging the jury to see beyond the uniform and focus on the evidence. "This isn't about vilifying law enforcement," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "It's about recognizing that trust is earned, not given. If we fail to hold individuals accountable for their actions, we betray the very principles our justice system is built upon." Gregory Hayes followed with a passionate plea for leniency, reminding the jury of the complexities of police work. Fear clouds judgment, he argued. And while mistakes were made, they do not define Officer Reynolds or his years of service. When the final gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, the room fell silent. Jurors filed out to begin deliberations, their faces unreadable masks of concentration. For the next several days, the nation waited anxiously for their verdict, knowing that the outcome would shape conversations about policing and accountability for years to come. Whether justice would prevail or elude once again remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the world was watching. The days following the conclusion of the trial were a tense and emotional roller coaster for everyone involved. Jurors, sequestered in a quiet room away from the public eye, pored over the evidence with painstaking care. Each piece of testimony, each frame of body cam footage, and every word spoken during closing arguments was dissected and debated. The weight of their decision hung heavily in the air, not just because of its impact on Officer Mark Reynolds' life, but because it carried symbolic significance for millions of people watching the case unfold. For Elena Ramirez, those days felt like an eternity. Though physically recovering, she found herself unable to shake the anxiety that had taken root in her mind. Friends and family surrounded her, offering words of encouragement, but even their presence couldn't fully ease the uncertainty gnawing at her. She spent hours reflecting on what the verdict might mean, not just for herself, but for the larger movement she had inadvertently become a part of. Would justice be served? Or would the system once again fail to hold someone accountable? Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Protesters gathered daily, their numbers growing as news outlets reported updates on the deliberations. Signs reading, "Justice for Elena and no more excuses," dotted the landscape, while chants echoed through the streets. Activists handed out flyers explaining the importance of the case, urging passersby to pay attention and demand change. Social media buzzed with hashtags, memes, and heartfelt posts expressing hope or frustration, depending on the latest rumor or leak. It seemed as though the entire nation was holding its breath, waiting for the jury's decision. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable when the jury finally returned after 3 grueling days of deliberation. Spectators crammed into every available seat, some clutching tissues, others gripping hands tightly. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised to capture every detail. Judge Margaret Holloway called the room to order, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife. As the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict, the silence became almost unbearable. On the charge of attempted murder, the foreperson began, pausing briefly before continuing. "We find the defendant, Officer Mark Reynolds, guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the room. For many, it was a moment of vindication, a rare instance where accountability triumphed over privilege. But for others, particularly those who supported Reynolds, disbelief and anger quickly surfaced. The foreperson continued down the list of charges, delivering the same verdict for violating civil rights. By the time the final count was read, Tears streamed down faces throughout the gallery. Elena Ramirez sat stoically, her expression unreadable, though her clenched fists betrayed the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Judge Holloway wasted no time moving to sentencing. After hearing statements from both sides, including a tearful apology from Reynolds and a powerful plea for reform from Ramirez, she delivered her ruling. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice firm and unwavering, "you abused your authority and violated the trust placed in you by the community. Your actions have caused irreparable harm not only to Ms. Ramirez, but to countless others who now fear those tasked with protecting them." With that, she sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty allowed under the law. The courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and cries. Supporters of Ramirez embraced one another, overcome with emotion, while Reynolds' family wept openly. Outside, the verdict sparked immediate reactions. Jubilant crowds celebrated in the streets, chanting slogans and waving banners. Others remained somber, recognizing that while this victory was significant, it didn't erase the systemic issues still plaguing society. For many activists, the sentencing wasn't the end. It was merely a step toward broader reform. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the verdict reverberated across the country. Law enforcement agencies faced intense scrutiny, with calls for increased oversight and transparency dominating headlines. Internal investigations were launched in multiple departments, uncovering patterns of misconduct similar to those seen in Reynolds' case. Some officers resigned rather than face accountability, while others expressed frustration at being lumped together with bad actors. Still, there was undeniable momentum behind the push for change, driven by stories like Ramirez's. For Reynolds, the reality of his sentence set in slowly. Stripped of his badge and uniform, he entered prison as a convicted felon, his status as a former officer doing little to shield him from the harsh realities of incarceration. Letters poured in from supporters and detractors alike, some defending his character, others condemning his actions. Meanwhile, his legal team filed appeals hoping to overturn the verdict. Yet for many observers, the damage had already been done, not just to Reynolds personally, but to the institution he represented. Elena Ramirez, meanwhile, began rebuilding her life. Physically, she was healing, though scars, both visible and invisible, remained. Emotionally, she struggled with the trauma of reliving the shooting repeatedly during the trial. Therapy sessions became a lifeline, helping her process the pain and channel it into something constructive. Publicly, she emerged as a leading voice in the fight for police reform, using her platform to advocate for policies aimed at preventing future tragedies. She spoke at rallies, appeared on talk shows, and met with lawmakers, tirelessly pushing for accountability measures like mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards, and stricter penalties for misconduct. Her resilience inspired countless others to share their own experiences with police brutality and racial profiling. Stories poured in from across the nation, each one underscoring the urgent need for systemic change. Organizations dedicated to civil rights and criminal justice reform saw a surge in donations and volunteer sign-ups, fueled by the renewed sense of purpose ignited by the trial. Even skeptics admitted that the verdict marked a turning point, a moment when the scales of justice tipped ever so slightly toward fairness. But Ramirez knew better than anyone that true progress wouldn't come overnight. While the verdict brought a measure of closure, it also highlighted how much work remained to be done. She often reminded audiences that justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about creating a world where such wrongs couldn't happen in the first place. Her message resonated deeply, galvanizing communities to keep fighting for a future free from fear and discrimination. As months passed, the ripple effects of the case continued to spread. Legislators introduced bills aimed at increasing transparency within policing, while grassroots movements gained traction in towns and cities nationwide. Schools incorporated discussions about systemic racism and accountability into their curricula, ensuring that younger generations understood the importance of equity and justice. For Ramirez, these developments offered a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through if enough people refused to look away. Though the road ahead was long, The verdict against Officer Mark Reynolds served as a powerful reminder of what could be achieved when courage met determination. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it proved that change was possible. And for Elena Ramirez, that knowledge was enough to keep her going one step at a time. Months after the sentencing of Officer Mark Reynolds, the nation was still buzzing with the aftermath of the case. The verdict had become a watershed moment, a rare instance where accountability pierced through layers of systemic protection. For Elena Ramirez, life began to take on a new rhythm, one shaped by healing, advocacy, and an unshakable determination to ensure that her experience wasn't in vain. Her journey from victim to advocate became a beacon of hope for marginalized communities across the country, inspiring countless others to stand up and demand change. As she continued recovering physically, Ramirez threw herself into her work as a federal prosecutor with renewed vigor. But this time her focus shifted beyond courtroom battles. She realized that true justice required more than winning cases. It demanded addressing the root causes of inequality and abuse. Armed with her story and the lessons learned from the trial, she embarked on a mission to transform the systems that had allowed someone like Reynolds to operate unchecked for so long. She started speaking at conferences, town halls, and community meetings, sharing not just her pain but also practical solutions to prevent similar tragedies. Her speeches resonated deeply because they came from a place of authenticity. She didn't shy away from discussing the trauma of being shot or the fear of losing trust in law enforcement. Yet, she balanced these raw emotions with calls for unity and progress. "We can't erase the past," she often said, her voice steady and resolute. "But we can build a future where no one has to live in fear of those sworn to protect them." Her words struck a chord with audiences, sparking conversations about accountability, transparency, and the role of law enforcement in society. The impact of her advocacy extended far beyond individual speeches. Lawmakers began drafting legislation, inspired by her recommendations. Bills aimed at mandating body cameras for all officers, creating independent oversight boards to investigate misconduct, and implementing stricter penalties for violations gained traction in state houses nationwide. Activist groups rallied around these efforts, organizing campaigns to pressure elected officials into action. Even some police departments, recognizing the growing demand for reform, took steps to improve training programs and foster better relationships with the communities they served. Ramirez also collaborated with civil rights organizations to launch initiatives focused on education and awareness. One such program targeted schools, teaching students about the importance of equity, consent, and civic engagement. Another initiative provided resources for victims of police misconduct, offering legal aid, counseling, and support networks. These projects weren't flashy or glamorous, but they represented tangible ways to create lasting change, one person, one community at a time. Despite the progress, resistance remained. Some critics dismissed Ramirez's efforts as overly idealistic, arguing that sweeping reforms would undermine the effectiveness of law enforcement. Others accused her of harboring anti-police sentiments, despite her repeated affirmations that she believed in the vital role officers played when operating ethically. Protesters occasionally showed up at her events, holding signs that read, "Support our cops," and shouting slogans meant to drown out her message. But rather than letting these challenges discourage her, Ramirez saw them as proof that her work mattered. If people were willing to fight against her ideas, it meant they were paying attention, and that gave her hope. For many within law enforcement, the case prompted introspection. While some officers doubled down on defensive postures, insisting that incidents like the one involving Reynolds were isolated anomalies, others acknowledged the need for reform. Internal discussions about implicit bias, de-escalation tactics, and community policing gained momentum. Training programs evolved to emphasize empathy and communication skills, aiming to reduce confrontational encounters. Though slow and sometimes reluctant, these shifts signaled a growing recognition that public trust could only be rebuilt through consistent, meaningful action. In the media, the case continued to dominate headlines, serving as both a cautionary tale and a call to action. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative reports explored every angle of the story, shedding light on systemic issues while amplifying voices often ignored. Journalists interviewed experts, activists, and everyday citizens, weaving together narratives that highlighted the human cost of unchecked power. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags and threads dissecting each development, ensuring that the conversation remained alive and relevant. For Reynolds, life behind bars offered little solace. Stripped of his authority and stripped bare of excuses, he faced daily reminders of the consequences of his actions. Fellow inmates treated him with hostility, viewing him as a traitor to their shared plight. Letters from supporters dwindled, over time, replaced by silence and isolation. Appeals filed by his legal team made little headway as courts upheld the original verdict. To many, his fate served as a stark reminder that accountability knows no exceptions, not even for those who once wore badges. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the case lay in its ability to galvanize ordinary people. From small towns to major cities, individuals inspired by Ramirez's courage began taking action in their own communities. Neighbors organized neighborhood watch programs designed to complement, not replace, law enforcement efforts. Parents taught their children about racial equality and the importance of standing up for what's right. Young activists used art, music, and storytelling to spread awareness, proving that creativity could be a powerful tool for change. Elena Ramirez herself never claimed to have all the answers. She understood that dismantling centuries-old systems of oppression was a monumental task, one that couldn't be accomplished overnight or by a single person. What she did offer, however, was a roadmap rooted in resilience, empathy, and relentless optimism. She reminded everyone that justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers. It was about creating spaces where kindness triumphed over cruelty, where fairness outweighed favoritism, and where trust replaced fear. By the first anniversary of the verdict, tangible changes were visible. Police departments reported fewer complaints of misconduct, thanks in part to improved training and oversight mechanisms. Community relations improved as officers engaged in outreach programs and listened to feedback from residents. Legislators passed landmark bills enshrining reforms into law, marking significant victories for advocates. And though challenges persisted, there was an undeniable sense of forward momentum, a collective belief that the arc of history bent toward justice, however slowly. For Ramirez, the year ended on a reflective note. Standing before a crowd gathered to commemorate the anniversary, she paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over her. "This isn't my victory," she said finally, her voice soft yet firm. "It belongs to everyone who refused to stay silent, who stood up, who fought back. We've taken important steps, but our journey is far from over. Let's keep pushing, keep dreaming, keep believing that a better world is possible." As applause erupted around her, Ramirez smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that spoke volumes. It wasn't just a gesture of gratitude, it was a promise to continue fighting, to keep shining a light on injustice, and to remind the world that even in the darkest moments, hope could prevail. Because for Elena Ramirez, justice wasn't just a destination. It was a lifelong pursuit.